What's up, amigos? Commander Jaime here today, and we're doing an Ancient Dragons standard deck profile. So this is new to the whole channel. We're doing Tachikaze as a whole. This is honestly a really fun budget deck. If this is something that you want to spend a couple dollars just to build, just to have some fun. I've been enjoying this deck a lot as a fun budget deck. And what really differentiates Ancient Dragons from the typical Gaia and the Anchor Blader equip gauge playstyle is that it has all of the Ancient Dragons with one skill, all in common. And that skill is that Vanguard Circle, Rearguard Circle, when you dry track a front trigger, you may have these units get crit. So all of your board can all of a sudden just become crit 2 and become very threatening when the opponent's at 4, or if you're Vanguard swinging and your opponent's at 3. So it kind of gives you that exhilarating feeling when you drive check that front trigger. And if that's something that you're looking for, that RNG extra fun, this is really the deck for you. So if you wanted to step away from the typical equip gauge playstyle, this is something to try out. What this deck does, it only has so many Ancient Dragons, and so there are some non-Ancient Dragons that are in this build, and I'll talk about how those support the main winning image of the deck at that point. And so the main winage, at least for me, is that when we are attacking, we have a full board of front row rear guards that are Ancient Dragons. And of course you have boosters that help push that trigger threshold of 22k, 23k, especially if you whiff. When you whiff, it's kind of a bad turn, but I mean, if you're able to make column 9s that actually get past that 23k line, then it's okay at that point. So when you get that front trigger, then they all of a sudden become 32k and 33k, but wow. 33k really is something to be reckoned with. So let's start right into it. So for the main grade 3s, we have 2 grade 3s that we only have accessible, and we're playing both of them at 4. The main one that you want to ride to is Bladermus. And so what Bladermus does is that Vanguard Circle, once per turn, you can retire one of your rear guards, also retire your opponent's rear guards of your choosing, and then search up to 1 card with Ancient Dragon in its card name and call it your rear guard circle. And that unit also gets plus 5k to the end of the turn. And so really what that does, it decks things your deck, and it sets up your board the way that you want it to be. So we want to make sure that we have these Ancient Dragons, so that way they get the benefit of actually getting critical when you drive check the front trigger. Not only that, you're properly building your structures, your field formations in a way that you can actually get through those numbers too and become a threat. And because you're also retiring at least 1 rear guard, your opponents, you're also dwindling their resources in that aspect, so it's very key. So with that skill being said, you're probably wondering what's the key cards that we search for. And really the go-tos for the most part are really the Triceratops cards. So for the grade 3, when this card is placed on Vanguard Circle or Rearguard Circle, so you could ride this if you have to, but ideally you want to call it with the other guy, this card can counterblast 1, draw you a card, and then it gets plus 5k to the end of the turn. So this becomes a 17k beater. If you put this on an Excel 2 circle, you hit 22k on its own. It gives you that draw, so you start building back of your advantage, because we want to commit to the board. We want to get some hands so that we could actually survive for the next turn if we don't finish the game. You may be able to use that skill to dig deeper into the deck. So if you're like short on Ancient Dragons, or you're trying to dig into some of the Ancient Dragons that you need to build that field formation, that really helps with that advantage. It is not once per turn, like a hard once per turn. So if you call multiple of these, whether from hand or from Bladermus skill, you can start drawing a couple cards by paying that counterblast as well. And so the other key card is really the grade 2s. This one in particular, have Cyreckle. So this card has a simple skill, but it's also effective. Is that when it's a rearguard circle and an additional one, this card cannot be retired by your opponent's card effects, and it gets plus 5k as well. It's a continuous skill, so which means this guy on Excel 2 is always a 90k beater by himself. And if you call it with Blader Mouse over here, he gets an additional 5k, so you hit that magic number of 24k. The nicety of not being able to be retired by your opponent's effects is nice, especially going against like Kagero, for example. It does not get around Shirane or Vanquisher where they're binding cards, so I guess you can defend with everything, but it's just a nice little have to have. But the point is, this card is one of those key pieces that you could put in an additional circle, and it becomes a 24k beater to be reckoned with. And then of course, if you get a front trigger, it becomes 34k at that point. So the other grade 2 that we have is Alonores. Man, they have some interesting names. But this card is restricted when it's placed from hand, so it's not really a target for belligerence at that point. It's really just when you write it. You can call it during your grade 3 turns as well from hand, and so what it does, you can counterblast 1, look at the top 3 cards of your deck, choose, you can call up to one of your ancient dragons from it, call it to rear guard, and then bottom deck the rest in any order. And it really gives you that gold paladin feel for liberators back in the day. That's what it reminds me. And this helps you build a field, and so this card is still appreciated, especially if you're able to write out your first grade 2 turn. You typically have that one counterblast that you could just use right away, and you can start building some cool battlefield formations though that may help you do your grade 2 turn or set up for your grade 3 turn that following turn, essentially. Now, you're probably wondering, there's only 8 grade 2s, and like I said, there's only so many ancient dragons. I did try one of the new grade 2s, I forgot what his name is, but he started with a T, and so when he was called from hand, you can counterblast 1, draw a card, and then call something. But really, I use that card as like digging deeper into the card, into my deck for combo pieces, and I found myself not really calling that card anyway. I would just kind of like dump it as an 5k shield, or discard it with a PG cost, and so really, I just reduced it to 8 grade 2s. So that forced me to really depend on this guy Alaneros, and then of course have Sirocco, because most of the time these are going to be in your front row. But not only that, we have Barrel Tops, the grade 3, that's also going to be in your front row. So it found myself where I'd rather have some boosters or some cards that kind of help me build these fields that I'm trying to strive for. So with that being said, I shrunk it down to 8 grade 2s. We've seen it with different decks. I definitely recommend with your mulligan be very mindful of that, because if you don't open with a grade 2, there is a chance you don't get it and you have to GSS, and that's a bad time. So I highly recommend trying out some task hands and then be intentional with your mulligan, because you do have 8 grade 2s in this build, of course. So with that, we're going into the grade 1s. So the ancient dragons from this is we have Albertail. So what it does, again, it's a very simple skill but yet effective. It's a continuous Vanguard Rearguard Circle skill. During your turn, if your Vanguard is an ancient dragon, it gets plus 5k. So if you write this is automatically a 13k Vanguard on its own on grade 1 turn. It's a booster that's a 13k, and it's also can be an attacker in the front row for your Rearguard turns. For your grade 3 turns to be as a Rearguard. And so with the numbers that you put behind, let's say your Alaneros, 8 plus 9 is 17, and then an additional 5 makes 22k. So right off the back, it helps with those numbers. That's why it's like, yet so simple, yet so effective. It's one of those key boosters that you want to make sure to make numbers. And then of course, if you have to, you could always just call it in an Excel circle and go from there as well. So with the Petrified, this is the other ancient dragon. Vanguard Circle or Rearguard Circle, when it attacks, or the attack that it boosted hits a Vanguard, then you could look at the top 7 of your cards, look for an ancient dragon, call it to Rearguard Circle as rest, and then shuffle your deck. So key things with this card. This helps you build your field +1 every time that this hits or boosts. So you could have multiple in the field, and you can keep having them hit the Vanguard if they let it pass by, and you can start slowly generating a field +1/+1. One of the cool things that I do for my grade 1 turn is that if I write to the Vanguard or I pull it behind the Vanguard, it becomes a threat that typically your opponent wants that first counterblast, and so it may hit through. And so whether this be a booster or the Vanguard itself, you get the chance to add that +1 to your field. And not only that, if it's behind the Vanguard, turn by turn, you have this unhit pressure every turn, and you're slowly generating advantage on the field. So that way you can conserve your hand and start building an effective field. And so that's why I was talking about that. I rather have focus on the grade 1s to be boosters. These are phenomenal boosters on hit pressure, and we have power at that point. And so really what helps with the whole synergy of the deck is the non-ancient dragon cards. So right off the back, the one that really popped up the most, and I've seen this with other similar builds, it's Lassitorex. And so this card is really like a placeholder card. And what I mean by that is that, like, if you were coming from Yu-Gi-Oh, for example, there's an Upstart Goblin card, a spell card, that lets you draw. Yeah, of course, you give 10,000 or 1,000 life points to your opponent. But point is, it's a placeholder card so you can dig deeper to your deck. You're kind of shrinking that deck size so you actually get to your pieces on a more consistent basis throughout your games at that point. So when you call this card to Rearguard Circle, you can put the top card of your deck into it as an quick gauge. But as soon as this card's retired from Rearguard Circle, then you could just Soul Blast 1 and then return that equip gauge, one of those equip gauge cards into your hand. So really what that does, it's you're drawing an extra card or digging deeper into an extra card into your deck at that point. That's it. And what's really cool is that you can just call another Rigard on top of it during your turn anyway, and force that, and you Soul Blast one and get that card. And so really, it really is like an Upstart Goblin at that point. Now it's not exactly as an Upstart Goblin, but it has that placeholder effect. And so what's cool is that if you combo this with the Blade Your Mouse skill, you retire it to search for something. This, you Soul Blast one and you get a card, so you're really +1 at that point. Whereas, like I mentioned before, if you called something over it, you break it even at that point. And if you have this on the front row, let's say in the early game, you really need to put that pressure. You can call it up in the front row, and your opponent has to really think about, like, do I really want to attack that card? Because if they do, then you can Soul Blast one and just get that card back. So you really don't lose any advantage. It's almost like in the GR this with Grenache being in the front row. It's like, do I really want to kill that Grenache and put it in the drop zone, you know? And it really helps with digging deeper into your key pieces. You can +1 with Blade Your Mouse, like I said. So other cards that I really thought to help out with the consistency as well as Prison Bird. And so Prison Bird is the great 3 searcher. Check the top 5 cards, add 1, discard 1. Not only that, but because we played this Lassitorax, we also have the first skill where it's if a new card was put into one of your units equip gauge, this becomes +5k. So it's a 13k beater at that point, or a booster. And again, like I said, if you can make some nice boosters, then your front row Ancient Dragons can have that pressure of getting that extra crit. Like I said, 13 plus the 9 gives you 22k, and then if you put behind a grade 3, you pass that 23k line as well for Forest clans at that point. And so that's why I play this card. Not only that, you really want to get your Blade Your Mouse, and if you see this card, Battle Tops, it's a great card because you can just call it, Counter Blast, draw a card, and start building a field. So both of them are key cards anyway. And so with that, it just helps with the synergy at that point. And because these are all grade 1s, they have 10k shield as well. So when I was playing like a non-grade 2, non-ancient dragon grade 2, it was just a 5k shield. So I really value the extra 5k coming from grade 1 if I decided not to call it or didn't have to call it at that point. So those are the little things that come in mind, because what I found out with this deck, you really don't draw a lot of cards. And that really impacts why we even have 1 PG as a grade 1 over here and 3 of the Sentinel crits. So as you're digging into your deck, you're drawing cards, but you're not really building the massive hand. Discarding with a PG sometimes kind of hurts, but I still like to play 1 or maybe 2. You could do the 2-2 ratio. But with this, you're able to like really, you know, guard those really big attacks for certain decks that have. But with this, because you're drawing, you know, cards from, let's say, Barrow Tops, and then of course Lassitorax that gets you a new card, that 30k shield is really nice to just 1 card drop. So that way you don't have to spend as much cards from your hand. And what happens too, if your drive track, you already did a front trigger, that is a once per turn skill. Like, you don't twin drive 2 front checks and go crit 3. It's a 1% once per turn skill that's restricted. And so if you drive track as the second one as the critical trigger, then you can go crit 3 at that point. Not only that, it's just something that it's a sentinel crit that we could just put into the triggers, but that's still a 1 card guard. That's really the key thing. And as you play with it, you'll realize that, like, oh wow, this kind of is nice. You could also play the draw PGs, and there's that argument where it's like, well, if this struggles with hand advantage, why not play the PGs? But again, you're drawing slowly cards with like Battle Tops and some of the other cards too that it might not be ideal or as easily to trigger those on a drive check. More than likely, you're going to see the front triggers. As you can see, we play a massive amount of front triggers. We're playing 4 here, and 2, so for a total of 10 front triggers. And I had to make room by reducing the heal triggers to 3. So that's why you see this odd ratio, is that I wanted to have these crit sentinels, but also have enough front triggers to be very threatening, and also so you want heal triggers too. So with that being said, because sometimes when you're writing up as a grade 1, as a grade 2, and as a grade 3, you're gonna rip a front trigger, and your opponent most likely is at a higher damage than you are. So resolving a heal trigger may not come as often, or it might be wasted at that point. So I reduced it so that way once you're into like that mid game, if your game goes that long, then you can resolve a heal trigger at that point. And again, 20k shield, but we do have the crit sentinel, so if we do draw into it, that's 30k shield. The PG, this is the one if you case you have to write it to, where you can just draw a card and discard. Again, it's another card that helps dig deeper into your deck, and so that's why it's valuable at that point. And then our starter is just the on ride draw one, and you get a quick shield if your opponent's grade 1 or graded. Also, I'd like to mention some like little key aspects too, like with barrel tops. If you call it with Blader Mouse and you put it in the Excelsior circle, it really becomes a big beater. So you have the +5 from him, the +5 from Blader Mouse, and the +5 from the Excel circle. That's plus 15k. So this becomes a 27k column on the Excel 2 circles. So once you start rewriting and you build more Excel circles, this card also becomes a key beater. Not only that, but with Petrified, if you already have a full board and your Vanguard hits or one of your columns hit, you can still proc the effect and actually search for an Ancient Dragon and call it behind something. The next turn, even if you call an Ancient Dragon that doesn't make sense, like if you call it a grade 2 or grade 3 in the back row, you can resolve skills like Barrel Tops, or let's say you call Arrow and Arrows, but it's useless in the back row, you could just retire next turn anyway to really search for that field again. And really why I do that sometimes is that you're decked in your deck. And with that, you know, if you get taking damage, more than likely you'll get a trigger. Especially what's cool is that because you have a field, a front trigger during your damage check actually helps you too, because all those units get plus 10k, so it's not as easily to bully your rear guards at that point. So those are some little key things too. Again, this is more of a budget deck, so it's not the best deck in the format, but it's really fun. Again, it's the RNG aspect that makes this deck fun. So if you didn't want that equip gauge style, this is something to try out. I'm actually considering to change this deck into a premium format, see what that even looks like, and I'll see what some stride options that helps that crit pressure and take advantage of the front trigger, so that way all these Ancient Dragons get that option of actually getting critical from a front trigger. I know there's some strides that give you extra drives, there are strides that restand so you see more drive checks, so there's just some options that I've been thinking, but I'm also going to test out, and so just be on the lookout for that once I start figuring some things out. And that with that being said, I also want to credit some of the videos that really helped out along. Is that 3 YouTubers in mind was, one was Winning Image, the second one was G Station, and the third was Team Generations. I'll put their links down there so you can see their videos. There's a lot of similarities and a lot of differences, and I saw their perspectives and thought process and helped to come up with this build. You'll see that my build's a bit different, especially with the 8 grade 2s. Like I said, it just didn't make sense with a non-Ancient Dragon. The whole point of the deck is you get in a front trigger and every line is crit 2. So any generic unit that didn't have crit pressure was something that the opponent's like, oh, just take that, get a damage, and I get a trigger, and now I can guard it easily. Where the other attacks, you take 2 damage and it's lethal at that point too. Not only that, I have my good friend Jerry Brock, who also is a Tachikaze main, since I know him, so he helped me with this too, and he actually gave me some ideas for premium, so be on the lookout for that. And again, if you guys like this format, if you like me doing standard profiles like this, just leave a like, comment down below, give me some feedback. Honestly, I appreciate any constructive criticism moving forward, and I hope you guys enjoyed my voice too. I got a new mic, so it sounds a little bit better. And of course, share this video. So see you guys, have a good one.